Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started. So thank you all for joining us for our Human Rights in Practice series event for today, Gender and Transitional Justice, Challenges from the Field with Kelli Muddell. Kelli is Director of the Gender Justice Program at the International Center for Transitional Justice, or ICTJ. ICTJ which is headquartered in New York with offices worldwide, works for justice in countries that have endured massive human rights abuses under repression or conflict. They work with victims, civil society groups, national and international organizations to ensure redress for victims and to help prevent atrocities from happening again. Kelli has provided technical assistance to women's groups and policymakers in over 15 countries on how transitional justice measures can address gender-based violence and can be responsive to the gendered consequences of human rights violations. She's overseen research projects which have contributed to expanding the ways in which transitional justice as a field conceptualizes gender and conflict-related harms. These topics have included sexual violence against men and boys and the gendered consequences of the crime of enforced disappearances. Today, Kelli will discuss trends in the field of transitional justice, especially with respect to gender-based violence and the impacts of violations committed during conflict. She will draw on examples from the extensive work that she's done in countries including Nepal, Tunisia, and Sri Lanka. And I'm especially happy to welcome Kelli here today, who is a good friend and someone who I had the privilege to work with many years ago. Our event today is co-sponsored by the International Human Rights Clinic and the Center for International Comparative Law, as well as the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, the International Law Society, and the Human Rights Law Society. And we're also grateful for two additional co-sponsors for today's event, the Coalition Against Gendered Violence and the Women Law Students Association. And Kelli will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open it for discussion. So any questions or comments you have, please do share them at that time. Thanks, Kelli.
Hi. I want to thank Aya and Jane for the invite. It's fabulous to be down here. It's particularly fabulous to be someplace where it's spring. I scared my taxi driver this morning because I exclaimed really loudly when I saw the first magnolia tree in bloom. It just seemed so amazing. But it's also great to be with all of you. As I was reading the description that we agreed upon of what I was supposed to talk about, I was like, wait, do I actually talk about that? So hopefully I do. I cover these things. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the challenges that I see within the transitional justice field in addressing gender-based violence and also women's experiences of conflict and authoritarianism. To do that, though, I'm going to start with definitions, which is irritating, but just easy. So, because we are a field that loves jargon. We love to use it, we love to use acronyms, and always forget to explain it. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, and also if I do say something and you're like, what does that mean? You should throw something at me and I will explain. But then also just take a little bit of time to talk about sort of the evolution of how a gendered approach, which I'll explain in a bit, has changed over time with the development of the field, because I think when looking at current challenges, it's important to also realize sort of how we got to where we are. And then hopefully, if I've planned this correctly, time-wise, spend the bulk of the time talking about sort of where I see we are at today with regard to addressing gender-based violence. But also, I think those things also sort of shine a light on the broader challenges the field is facing. So, what am I talking about when I say a gendered approach? So basic definitions. One's sex is dependent upon reproductive organs. So how you are born, male, female, what reproductive organs you have. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles based upon your sex. And it can also be how you view yourself internally that maybe doesn't match your reproductive organs that you were born with. But for this discussion, the way it's being framed is when we're talking about a gendered approach, what we're talking about is really looking at how individuals in society are expected to behave, the roles they're expected to play, based upon if they are male or female, and the power inequalities that come with that. So women in many societies are seen as, more passive, not necessarily natural leadership abilities, and this impacts maybe the access they have to politics. We all know about equal pay and the issues around women having the same economic opportunities that men do in many contexts. And so to look at those socially constructed roles and to look at the structural inequalities that come with it, those have a very deep impact on how individuals are targeted in times of authoritarianism and conflict for human rights abuses, what types of abuses they're targeted for, but then also the consequences of those. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we get into how the field has evolved and give examples. Now, what is transitional justice? So transitional justice is a term, a field that developed in a term that sort of came out of a look at Latin American dictatorships in the early 80s. So Argentina and Chile in particular were sort of at the forefront of this transition from a dictatorship to a more democratic system. And part of those dictatorships and sustaining them was this idea of hidden histories. So there was targeting of people for enforced disappearance, for torture, for sexual violence, but the regime kept itself self-sustaining by denying all of that. So when there was this moment of regime change, there was this idea of, well, we need to actually look into those hidden histories. If we're going to make a break with the past, we need to see what those are, and we need to actually provide redress for victims. So what are the elements of transitional justice? You'll also notice I will contradict myself a lot in this talk, which is something I just do naturally, but also I think there's a lot of contradictions in the field. So the way the field developed, it was really sort of seen as 4 basic elements. One was establishing the truth of what happened in a specific period about a legacy of massive human rights violations, providing redress for the victims who suffered those violations, reforming institutions that allowed those violations to happen, and then criminal justice process, confronting impunity and holding individuals responsible for what happened. And as the field developed, it essentially became, essentially it was reduced to those 4, but also it became very reduced to the idea of measures. So a truth commission, which you may have heard of, courts and how that's dealt with, vetting, security sector reform, and official reparations programs. As time has gone on, what we've found is that although this sort of idea of transitional justice was born out of the Latin American dictatorship experience, it began to then be applied in post-conflict periods. And so particularly in Africa, you began to see truth commissions in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Asia and Timor-Leste. And then with this also is part of this reliance on measures, is it became embedded into the Secretary General's general guidelines. In 2005, there's a document, and then that made its way into, we have a peace process. We should then look at how we deal with these past human rights abuses, and let's look at what's available, and let's maybe put them into peace agreements. And there's lots of problems with, I think, how this evolved. I think, to be just frank, I think my organization helped contribute to those, not because we were it's just the way I think the field evolved. And we were all learning and trying to sort of not make it up as we went along, but in some ways trying to adapt things as we went along. And so those things began to be used in a lot of post-conflict settings. And today what we're finding is there is a big push and demand, both on the ground, but also often from donor governments, to use them in more complicated settings of ongoing warfare. And part of this is because the nature of warfare is changing. We're having a lot of protracted conflicts. Syria as an example, with multi-state actors, non-state actors. And there is a big push that there needs to be a preparation for the time when a peace agreement maybe comes about, but also that something needs to be done in this moment. And so that is, I think, opening the door to broadening the field of transitional justice and to a less reliance on measures and very specific institutions, although I think those are still important, and you will still hear the international community talk about them a lot, but to look at more creative ways of how do you confront the past, and how do you prepare for those moments when maybe you can have more official institutions to address these issues. So the evolution of the gendered approach, I think at first the starting point was either institutions were gender blind or gender neutral. So if you look at the early truth commissions, they didn't really, in their mandates, they didn't think about sexual violence. They didn't put any special protocols to reach out to women. And the result is that their reports, if you look at the Argentinian Truth Commission report, had no reference to how women maybe experienced the violations differently, no reference necessarily to sexual violence. And so the assumption was maybe it didn't happen. And what you're finding out is decades later, now that there are prosecutions in Argentina, that actually sexual violence when people were in detention did happen, and it's slowly coming out. But because there was no proactive efforts, it just became invisible. The gender neutral idea was then it sort of came about with the South African Truth Commission, where they said, we don't want to be discriminatory, so we're going to be gender neutral. We're going to treat both men and women who come before the Truth Commission equally. And what the feminist community in South Africa did was then, as the Truth Commission was operating, they began to notice that the women who were coming forward only talked about the abuses against their sons, their fathers, and were not prioritizing in their statements talking about abuses that they suffered while in detention. And also women were coming forward in lesser numbers because they didn't feel safe. And so this was sort of the transition into the next phase, which was really, I think, that a recognition that there needed to be special efforts to reach out to women, particularly sexual violence victims, to create comfortable spaces, to give resources that institutions needed, to have specialized investigators in courts or in truth commissions, to analyze, could women receive reparations the same way that men did, or were there access issues? And that these things needed to be analyzed. Basically, you needed to look at the conflict or the authoritarian regime and its impact with a gendered lens, and you need to take these things into consideration. So in the end of the Truth Commission in South Africa, they gave interim reparations, which was a monetary compensation it was supposed to then be supplemented by a much larger reparations program. But they had given initial reparations payments, and they were just being either given as checks or deposited into bank accounts. And what they realized was, because they had commissioners and the women's rights community, they had commissioners who were interested in this issue and following it, but also they had the women's rights community monitoring the process, was that the checks that were going to women, they didn't have bank accounts to deposit them in. So they were handing, particularly in rural areas, in the capital and in the major cities, they often did. And so what they realized in follow-up with these women is these women would give the checks to their husbands or their fathers, and they would never see the money. So they had to then find a different way to get that money to the women so that they could then keep it for themselves, because it was addressing the harms they had faced, and so that they could use it in a way they felt appropriate to redress the harms they suffered. So there's this beginning of this recognition, and of course, at the same time, you have the international tribunals coming in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the development of jurisprudence around sexual violence. And the first time that these crimes are taken seriously and are set aside other crimes such as torture, extrajudicial killings in ways they hadn't been before, because it was always sort of dismissed as, well, boys will be boys, sexual violence happens, it's a private matter. Let's not bring it into the realm of these legal discussions. And so it was sort of a watershed moment where I think both for truth commissions and reparations programs and courts, where there was a recognition that you need to go above and beyond if you really want to address gender-based violence and really want to be able to secure women's participation in these processes. While those advances were amazing and great and actually still need to be, I think, safeguarded, because I don't think we should take them for granted, the sort of unintended consequence, I think, of those was that for a while, when you talked about gender and conflict or gender and transitional justice, there was the assumption you're only talking about women and that women's only experience of conflict or dictatorship is sexual violence. They're not impacted in any other ways that are tied to their gender. And so the next sort of push, and this came from Global South activists, and I think some also Northern-based activists who were trying to broaden the field's approach and really get the field to, and I didn't say actually, so the field, so that I think I did, but maybe not so clearly. The objectives of the field are really to confront impunity, to provide redress to victims, and to prevent future violence. And if you really want to do those three things, you actually need to look more broadly at how particularly women experience human rights violations, because there are actually gendered consequences to human rights violations. And so there was a push that truth commissions and reparations programs needed to go beyond sexual violence and begin to interrogate. So if you have a disappeared loved one who was taken, how does that impact your life if you are now, you've lost your husband and you're the mother raising a family? And how does it impact your life if you've lost a wife to disappearance and you're a man raising your family? So in interviews we've done with women in Nepal, and the vast amount of disappearances usually are men, but there are women who are disappeared, which often is actually an underreported category. But when we did interviews with women in Nepal and Lebanon with mothers and also wives of the disappeared, the impact of that disappearance and the way they could then cope with raising their family was very different than the impact on husbands who had lost wives. So the women couldn't make enough money to support their family. Their kids often had to drop out of school and get jobs. Quite often it was prioritized that the girls would drop out of school to get jobs to help support the family. They couldn't, in Lebanon, they couldn't travel with their children because they needed their husband or their father-in-law's approval to sign off on any traveling. They couldn't access bank accounts because their names weren't on the bank accounts. They couldn't sell their house because their names weren't on the deeds. In Nepal, women would say, I farmed my land my entire life of living here alongside my husband, but I now can't actually still have that land because my father-in-law has taken it away. And so the field began to recognize that there are these broader implications and that these need to be taken into account when you're assessing harms and you're really assessing like, okay, well, how are we going to provide redress to these victims? Because the harms they suffer are very dependent upon where they fit in society, where those socially constructed roles have placed them in terms of inequalities. And this was a great advance, and I think it's still something that's being worked on and pushed for. And then the final advance I want to talk about is something that actually kind of came in 2007, but has really entered policy maker language, I would say maybe 6 years ago. I'm like, what year are we in? So maybe that isn't, okay. And that's the idea of, so in 2007, a group of women's activists got together and met in Nairobi. and they wanted to put together a statement and a set of guidelines on reparations for sexual violence victims. And one of the elements that a reparations program seeks to fulfill is to return victims to the status quo. And we know that this is kind of impossible. If you've been tortured, if you've had your arm amputated, if you've been a victim of sexual violence, you can't be returned to how you were before that violation took place. But the notion was, we're going to do as much as we can to sort of repair the harm, to return you to where you were so you can function in society. And these activists argued that in nearly every context where transitional justice had been applied and where reparations programs had been thought of or designed or even pursued, that returning women to the status quo, to return them to the position they were in, is returning them to a position where they are vulnerable to further violence and further discrimination. And so their argument was, it's not enough to just take into consideration when you're designing a reparations program, this is the harm you suffered this violation, arbitrary detainment. You suffered arbitrary detainment. We are going to give compensation to all those who suffered arbitrary detainment of X amount, and not take into consideration that when women came out of maybe being political prisoners, that they were viewed very differently than their male counterparts. So this happened in Morocco. The Moroccan Truth Commission, in its documentation, what it found is that men who had been released as political prisoners were considered heroes. They had fought the good fight against the kingdom. They were welcomed back in their communities. Their wives were waiting for them, and they resumed their lives. And they had the scars and the post-traumatic stress. They had all the harms that are associated with arbitrary detainment. But women who also had those harms, the consequences, once they were released, were very different. So their husbands had often left them. They often, if they had not been married, were considered to not be eligible for marriage because it was assumed they had been sexually violated in prison. They had also it was seen as they had stepped outside of their role as the passive woman who should stay in the home because they had taken political action against the government. And so the Truth Commission, in assessing this and designing the reparations program, said, we really need to acknowledge this. And so we're gonna, and I don't know how they calculated this because it's completely arbitrary, but they essentially said, men who were politically detained and released get X amount. Women who are politically detained and released get X amount plus an additional 7%. Because this recognizes that the social safety net isn't there for them. They're not going to make as much money when they get out. Their husbands are likely gone or they can't get married. And in Moroccan culture, that is your social safety net going forward. And they're going to likely face community, they're going to have stigma and shame, and they're going to be ostracized. And so we need to do something to acknowledge that. And we can't just treat the harms that they have experienced the same as we treat men. So this is kind of the idea that was put on the table by the Nairobi Declaration and has slowly been taken up, first by the Moroccan Truth Commission, well, first by, I think, Sierra Leone, but they didn't call it the Sierra Leone Truth Commission, but they didn't call it having a transformative impact. But the Moroccan Truth Commission, and then it's gotten now into policymaker circles. So if you read any of UN Women's documents around transitional justice, it's listed. Transformative impact. It can have a transformative impact, and this is like asserted. Now, this brings me to what is sadly the bulk. I've wasted a lot of time of what I want to talk about, which is current challenges. And first, I just want to say most of the current challenges I talk about are around this idea of transformative impact, because I think it provides a nice lens into the challenges the field is facing more broadly, but where we're at in terms of addressing gender-based violence. But I first want to say that I think we've made these advances in the field with regard to knowing that women, their special procedures have to be put in place to get women to participate so they feel comfortable for confidentiality purposes. We've learned now that sexual violence victims need to have, in particular, need to be treated in a certain way. They need to have psychosocial support. There need to be resources for this. There's been all of these lessons. And still, we still face in every new context we go in for our work, pushback on it of some sort. So while we have evolved quite a bit in how we're thinking about this, and I think what's seen as best practice, there's still this vigilance of we need to still assert these things. So, for example, the Ivory Coast had a Truth Commission a couple years ago, and I had conversations with one of the female commissioners. She was in New York, and she came from a women's rights background, and she was like, women were targeted during the conflict. I'm really concerned that the Truth Commission isn't going to deal with this. Can you give me resources that back this up of how other Truth Commissions have dealt with this, and what's lost if you don't? And so we worked with her, and she went back and said to the other commissioners, one of the lessons learned is you need to have a specialized unit that focuses on this issue and assesses the problems that may come into with women accessing the institution. You need to think about how resources are going to be deployed, what types of violations you're going to look at. And so one way is creating a special subcommission, essentially, something numerous Truth Commissions have done to date. And the commissioner said to her, women didn't experience anything during the conflict. It was only men. And the female commissioners, too. It wasn't just the male commissioners. And they're like, you're going to have to write something that proves that women actually were victimized. So she did. And she presented it to them. And they said, okay, you can have a subcommission. And then this gets to my next point of, I think, one of the challenges is to the field is that, and I referenced this earlier about the reliance on mechanisms, is I think as the field has developed and as policymakers, I think policymakers love to create checklists. We love to have the list of, this is how you do it right, this is what's been learned, so we're going to check it off, and then you're good. And I think as the field has gone on and as more countries have used these measures, governments have become increasingly savvy on how to manipulate the international community and how to manipulate these checklists. So it wasn't just because this female commissioner presented this report that this subcommission was created. It was also because the UN and donor governments that were funding said, you know what, you need to have a gender subcommission. You need to focus on this. And so they said, okay, we'll do it. The box was checked. The donor governments were happy. In this situation, the UN mission was happy. And they then proceeded to bury the subcommission so deeply within the organogram and within the structure of the commission itself that it had no power. The only thing it was able to produce was the same report she presented at the very beginning to get them to agree to have the subcommission in the first place. So no special outreach to women victims, no special questions about sexual violence on the statement-taking form, none of these things. And it was intentional, but they got the international community off their backs. And that's, I think, something that we're really struggling with, is how to read intentions of these institutions now, because I think governments are savvy and they know that this is what is required of them often. This is what the international community wants to see. They want to see these measures put into place. So we'll do what we can, and then we'll move on. And it was, I think the commission was a spectacular failure in many ways. Also because it was very corrupt, and there were also issues with that. But it didn't do, and I think the international community took its eye off the ball. It didn't keep the pressure going. So that's just to say that I think all these challenges, you still have to be so vigilant, both local women's rights groups on the ground, but also the international community in ensuring that, like, we're not just falling into this approach of, you know, you hit all the right marks, so we're assuming it's all going to work out, because it doesn't always. And let's go back to transformative impact. So it's interesting because these debates within my institution, the organization I work for, cause such like intensity. And there's so much disagreement about it. And it's not only transformative impact when we're talking about the lives of women, and are we really, you know, able to sort of look at structural inequalities and challenge structural inequalities through a truth commission or through some sort of reparations process. There's a concern, I think, about raising victims' expectations, and there's a concern that we're putting too much on these institutions, and I think that that is a really valid concern. But what has usually happened with this debate is that you have two camps. In my experience, and I think this is beginning to change, but in my experience, you have the camp that I encountered in Colombia, which has a very elaborate transitional justice system, a very active, high-capacity women's rights movement. They have checked all the right boxes and are really trying to implement them when it comes to having a gender approach. And we were talking, I was there for a workshop, and we were talking about reparations, and they just kept saying, you know, it's going to be transformative. And so finally I was like, what does that mean? When you say it's going to be transformative, this reparations program, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, it's going to completely redo the gender relations in the family. And I was like, no, it's not. I was like, this is why when I go back to my organization and I say, let's talk about transformative impact, my colleagues on one side of the debate are like, no, don't say those words. Like, just literally don't say those words. Because a truth commission can't undo gender relations in society. It can challenge gender inequalities. It can ensure that women aren't disadvantaged in reparations benefits, because we're not looking at how these structural inequalities impact them. But I think there is a sense of, we're either going to throw those words out there in policymaker documents, but we're not going to define what it actually means. And so then on the ground, you have this situation where people think our lives are going to be transformed. And then you have the other camp, which is the camp of, don't ever speak those words. Transitional justice transforms nothing. We can't talk about it. And I think that this is where, I think the middle ground, because I think there has to be a middle ground. If we're really talking about transitional justice as a tool to prevent future violence and to provide adequate redress, we have to be looking at the structural inequalities that shape how women and men experience violence and the impact in their lives. We just have to. And we have to at least challenge those. And so I think the question actually is, in finding that middle ground, and I think there's been very little discussion on that middle ground, is what do we mean by transformation? What do we mean by transformative impact? And what do we mean by change? What type of change are we looking for? And so Clara Sandoval wrote a piece, I think it's one of the first pieces that actually has sort of a nuanced analysis of this, in a publication we came out with last year. It's called Justice Mosaics, and it looks at different contexts, how contexts have changed over time that transitional justice is being applied in, and the sort of different elements of that. And she defined transformative impact as essentially changing the ideologies that support structural inequalities. And her argument, I think rightly so, is that you can't expect these measures that come about, that are time-bound, that are put into place to deal with massive legacies of abuse, that operate for maybe 3 years, 4 years max, to be able to do that. Because often we're talking about intergenerational change that needs to happen to deal with these types of ideologies. But also there is no way that they can influence the institutions in a way that that type of change needs to happen. But what they can do is contribute to it. and they can liaise with other peace-building efforts and development efforts to challenge those. So truth commissions can establish findings on root causes of a conflict that then propose reforms for institutions that address those types of gender inequalities that exist. To give you an example, in Sierra Leone, the Truth Commission, which really was the first that did this amazing tracing of looking at continuities of violence. And there were, during the 10-year conflict in Sierra Leone, there was high levels of sexual violence, really atrocious things that were taking place. And they were given a mandate to deal with sexual violence. And the way they interpreted that mandate was, sexual violence, it did happen to men, but the majority of victims, and they did look at that, they did look at sexual violence against men, but they said the majority of victims were women. And so we really need to look at how women's lives were lived during the conflict, but also why were they targeted to be bushwives? Why were they targeted to be sexual slaves? Why were they seen as that was an acceptable thing to do? And then they were going to give recommendations for reparations, and then so they felt they needed to ask the questions, okay, so now that you are post-conflict and you're trying to integrate back into your communities, like, what is that like for you? And what they did was they traced this basically continuity of, because women were seen as property to be owned in much of Sierra Leone under certain customary law, that it's not such a huge leap that they would then be seen as being able, as if they're property, then of course, when armed groups come in, they're going to take them and use them as sexual slaves. They're going to take them and use them as porters. They're going to, use them as bushwives. And then they said, well, post-conflict, those women are now unable to often go back and make a living off their land because their husbands have died and they don't have land ownership titles, unless they marry the brother of their husband, and then they can have the land, or at least farm it. They are unable, because they are relegated to an informal economy, they are unable to then essentially make enough money to support their families. And so they traced how these structural inequalities basically fed through the life of these women and made them vulnerable to specific types of abuses, but really shaped the way they experienced these abuses. And so one of their main recommendations was, you need to have a rewriting of the laws in Sierra Leone so that customary law is not allowed to trump the gender equality provision in the Constitution, which under the Constitution at that point it was allowed to. And so they proposed this, and this, it was the same thing women's rights groups have been proposing forever, so it wasn't like an entirely new thing, but it shed light, particularly from the international community, on a reintroduction of these issues in Parliament. And so they passed the gender laws. And that is seen, and that is something I always say is an example of some sort of transformative impact, because they challenge those structural inequalities that made women vulnerable to these abuses. Now, this then ties back to one of Clara Sandoval's arguments as to, can you really have transformative impact? Which is one of the conditions she talks about is, it really depends on if you're talking about a context where you have strong state institutions, or you're talking about a context where you have very weak state institutions that have to be built from scratch. So in a lot of dictatorships, you have incredibly strong state institutions. They may have numerous problems, they may be corrupt, but they're strong and there's a bureaucracy. Doing a lot of work in Sri Lanka, very complex bureaucracy, strong state institutions, which brings its own problems, but there's no building from scratch. In Sierra Leone, you did not have courthouses outside of the capital. During the conflict, there was only one lawyer operating outside of the capital. So these gender bylaws that were passed, great, awesome. I've quoted this example as fabulous, UN Women's quoted this example as fabulous, But because there are weak institutions, the long-term impact of that, who knows how it's being felt? It probably isn't, because most women then have to rely on their customary leaders outside of the Capitol to intervene in any justice disputes. And I think this gets to another thing, which is that in order to have a transformative impact, or to have any impact in transitional justice, you have to see transitions as a very long-term process. It is not we fund something as a donor community for 5 years, and then we move on to the next hotspot, and it's fixed. That is what happens, but it's not fixed. And we're seeing a recurrence of violence in a lot of contexts that actually had quite strong transitional justice measures, Kenya being one. So I think that the structural changes, I think one of the interesting thing about it is I think it's like finding that wedge in the gender inequalities and kind of trying to pry it open a little bit so that you're assisting all these other efforts, be it development, peace building work, women's rights work on the ground, to take advantage of that. But I think the way it's been phrased and often interpreted is that it's something that will happen and it will happen soon. And I think that then gives a lot of ammunition to people who don't want to talk about, let's not look at root causes, let's not look at why women are targeted, let's not look at any of these things because it's just too much and nothing's going to happen. So then that brings us to the individual change, right? And this is really tricky because the 7% increase for that woman who was arbitrarily detained in Morocco, I don't know what the impact of that was in her life. I don't know how she would interpret that. Probably not as transformative, maybe making a difference. And I think this also gets back to who's defining the language of what type of change we're looking for and how it's being communicated. So I had a donor say to me about 5 years ago, we were doing work in Uganda, and we had helped grassroots women's rights activists come together and present a bill in Parliament for gender-sensitive reparations program. And it was passed. And the donor happened to be on the ground at that point, and she said, why didn't you count these women when you were supposed to report on the lives of women you had changed? Which is problematic in and of itself, that we were asked to count our work in changing women's lives. And we had noted that at the beginning of the proposal, but nevertheless, they have to report to their donors. And she said, because these women were expressing their lives had changed. 5 years later, there's no reparations program. Museveni hasn't acted on it. And I think if you go back and talk to those women, they would have a very different perspective on that experience than they do now. Same with the Hussein Habre case. I heard a woman who does court monitoring on that case, who had done court monitoring, talk about how the case was really built on the backs of these women, and then eventually sexual violence. They began to talk about sexual violence, and those charges got included in the case. And she was there on the day he was convicted, and the women were elated. And they had risked their lives to give this testimony, and they were ecstatic, and they felt empowered, and they said all these things to her about how this was so momentous and it marked so many things. And then she went back 3 months later to talk to them, to do like a follow-up. And she expected to find them like doing well and still enthusiastic that they had participated in the case. And they said, no, we wish we hadn't done it. Because we came back to our communities where we live in fear, because some people do know we testified, even though we were protected and they shouldn't have known, but word has gotten back. We live in conditions where, the elements, we get rained on, we have, I want to say shin tax, but that's not it. What is it? Like shacks, tin shacks. That's a big thing. And we have struggle still feeding our family. He's sitting in a courtroom, or he's sitting in a prison where he gets 3 square meals a day, he's warm, and he has cable. So who really won here? And I think that this points to another element of this whole idea of transformation, is what happens in a moment and what women feel in a moment in terms of change may not be what they feel long term. And I think these are some of the dilemmas within the field and within the way we go about trying to bring about justice. Now, okay, just a second. And then I want to get to one more example that I think is actually a positive example, since I've just given a lot of negative examples. Because I do think sometimes individual change or individual empowerment can occur. So I do a lot of work in Tunisia, and we worked with women outside of the capital. And one of the things the Tunisian Truth Commission did was they allowed for women who had family members who had been essentially impacted by the political activities of their male loved ones who had likely been imprisoned or tortured. Because there was a practice that of trying to dismantle the family. So if your husband was in prison, you and your kids were blacklisted for education, you were blacklisted for employment, you were shunned by your community, you were pressured to divorce and marry policemen. There were all these implications. And we worked doing outreach on behalf of the Truth Commission about who qualified to come forward and testify. And what we found was that a lot of those women, they didn't actually realize they could testify before the Truth Commission. And they would say, well, it was my husband that was imprisoned, so I don't really have anything to talk about. And we would start saying, well, what was your, what happened with you? And like, what was your life like? And they were like, oh, well, I couldn't have finished my education because I wasn't allowed to sit for exams because my husband was in prison. Or my kids, had to leave this school because their teacher would beat them every day because their father was in prison. And there were all these things that came out. And so they really, through this sort of massive education campaign that was done by the network we were working with, they really took ownership of those experiences. And they made a collective submission to the Truth Commission saying, these are our experiences. This is what we think about reparations in terms of the harms we suffered. And they handed it over. But they've also done something else, which is they just didn't leave it there. They just didn't leave it with the official process. But many of them have come together in this process that we've been supporting and they've been designing, particularly around this idea of what's known as the breadbasket in Tunisia. So when you had a relative that was in prison, in order for them to be able to eat properly, you had to take them food every week. And this meant that, women who were already trying to support their kids on probably an informal economy income had to essentially then make extra money to buy extra food to take. And they had to go to the prison to take it. There are women that I've spoken with who had relatives in multiple prisons. And what the government would do is they wouldn't put them in the same prison. They'd put them in prisons all throughout the country. So there's one woman I know of who she had relatives in 6 different prisons. So for 20 years, her life every day was traveling anywhere from 10 kilometers on a good day to 150 kilometers to visit those relatives and hand over the food basket. Her daughters dropped out of school to be able to pay for the food. She basically wasn't able to parent them. They lost a mother. She was harassed when she went to the prison. Stuff was stolen from the basket, so the stuff that she had given wasn't always even passed on. There's one woman who brought a food basket for her husband for 15 years, and he had been dead for 10, and they never told her. And these women, but no one knows about this. No one knows in larger Tunisian society about these issues. And these have long-term consequences, right? They're now in vast poverty because they have accumulated so much debt, or their children now have dropped out of school and can't get good jobs to help support them. And these women have worked to put together, essentially, they have told their stories and worked with different artists. There's a graphic novel about their experiences. There's a traveling museum exhibit that will go throughout the country where there will be community dialogues with the women afterwards to educate the community and to educate local leaders about maybe what they can do to respond to the harms and to the ongoing consequences of these violations. They have podcasts that they put together. We've worked with local radio stations. And they're increasing the public discourse about this type of abuse. And I've known one of the women since 2014 when I first met her. And I've known a lot of the women since 2015, 2016, but this one woman, to see the trajectory of her change from someone who right after the revolution was clearly really traumatized she had been a political prisoner herself, but also her son and husband had been political prisoners. And she then started her own organization, which she had done just as I met her, and has just is now a wildfire. She is just taking everyone on, and she is created this huge network of other victims in her community, and she's outspoken for them, and she's accessing services for them with the government. And for her, there are 10 others in each province that I don't, that I have met but don't know as well. And so I just want to say this about this is I think we often think of the way this has been defined as these transformative changes need to happen through institutions. And they don't always need to happen through institutions. These were women who were given, purely as an international organization because we have the funding, the platform for them to design what they wanted to do, how they wanted to tell their communities about their experiences, and how they wanted to advocate for what changes they wanted to see. And the Truth Commission, which is very plagued, I realize I'm now being taped, and I had signed off on that, likely not going to produce the way everyone had hoped it would. But they took advantage of this space that transitional justice opens up to push for change. And that's not going to go away, whatever was gained from that, no matter what the institutions do. So I think we need to also think about these things a lot more creatively. And instead of coming in and saying, we're going to do this because this is going to have a transformative impact, we let them design what they think is going to change, what they think is going to help themselves. And I think often, and this brings me to my final point, I'm sorry, policymakers, so as an international community, both as a technocrat and as policymakers, we have a responsibility, and it's something we talk about all the time, but we don't actually address head on, is around victims' expectations. So we've talked about the limitations of this idea of transformative potential. No one ever goes into a context and says, you know what, you have weak institutions, so you need to sort of temper what you're going to expect. And to just be honest, that you may get certain things now. Let's think long-term about what the short-term gains are, what the long-term gains are. But just to be honest with them, because they will, even no matter what you say, if you go in, this is their last chance, many of them feel, to find out the truth about their loved ones, to be recognized as victims. And they will expect what they think the international community should do and what their governments should do, which is to acknowledge their suffering and to combat the impunity and to do all of these things. And so I think we need to be much more honest about what can happen in each context and what is possible based upon previous experience. And I think we need to give a lot more agency to them in defining what they want to see happen and how they can get there maybe outside of these measures or in alongside these measures. And I have talked too long, so I apologize for the stuff there.
We have a few minutes for questions.
I'm Aziz Ahmadi, a good friend of Duke, although I haven't been fortunate enough to do anything in this building. My big question is, you mentioned a lot of countries with all the beautiful things that you have done. is any organization, anybody doing anything or thinking anything about the women rights in China? There was a talk about a month ago in Gross Hall by a PhD student, Chinese, with a ton of data. And that was especially after the new divorce law in China, talking about the things that I'm 88 years old. My father and mother, they lived together for 65 years in Iran. In Iran, the situation wasn't this bad 200 years ago. And now it is like this in China with absolutely no right. Is anybody thinking about that?
I think there are a lot of more typical human rights groups that do documentation and advocacy who are thinking about it. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. Within the transitional justice field, no. And I think in part because there hasn't been a transition, there's not an open armed conflict, and it is such a closed society that it's very difficult to do a lot of preparatory efforts that we do, say, in Syria. We're working with a lot of Syrian refugees in Turkey and in Lebanon who are doing documentation of what's happening inside Syria, and we're strategizing because they've come out, and we can we're hoping there'll be an end to the conflict. But the aim now is just to raise awareness, particularly in Europe, about what's going on, to put a human face on the suffering, in the hopes of also impacting how refugees are being seen in Europe. So China, no. It's a little bit of a black box, I think. But there are a lot of human rights groups that do advocacy and documentation who are doing plenty of work. Just no groups that I know of that are preparing for some change in a moment, that, an opening to actually be able to then go in and do something within the country. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Is there space for a transitional justice in an area, let's say there's not necessarily a regime change, but there's some sort of demarcating event like an attempted coup or lots of protests? Is there space for that framework and the gendered approach even when there's not a regime change?
Yeah, I think there is. I think you have to be really careful in how you do it, because depending upon if there are a lot of protests, depending upon what the reaction is. So in Bahrain, when there were a lot of protests, we actually were trying to do work with activists on the ground because they were documenting the abuses, and but there was such a government crackdown on that it actually put their lives at greater risk to be working with an international organization. And then you had the commission of, was it a fact-finding commission or commission of inquiry in Bahrain? It was one. And it was an incredibly sad situation where I think there were some prominent people who were considered human rights activists who were on it, who I think had good track records, and they, I think, signed off on pretty much a whitewashing of what had happened. And then that shut down that space, right? I'm trying to think of other contexts. Libya kind of became a massive mess when, there was a lot of talk about transitional justice, and there was a lot of talk about, and then you just have armed militias because there was just such a proliferation of weapons when Gaddafi fell, and then this is where it becomes tricky. So I think it's one, the safety of the human rights activists and defenders on the ground. And I think two, it's an issue of, is transitional justice going to be co-opted and used as we're not as bad as the previous regime. And, so they decided they were going to do reparations for sexual violence victims. I don't know if that actually ever came about. but it was hugely problematic because they just threw it out clearly to get everyone to shut up. But sexual violence victims had been treated horribly in the media. They've been treated horribly by those who had spoken out, by government officials to that point. And they also had no plan to do reparations for anyone else, which then made all the other victims of Gaddafi then angry at the sexual violence victims. And it created a division within civil society. So I think it's really very context specific and sort of where the political actors are in terms of political will to allow for something to happen, and also the safety issues. Yeah, I don't know if you have a specific context in mind, but it's yeah, it really is very context specific, I think.
We're out of time, but thank you again to all of you for joining us today, and thank you, Kelli.
Really? Yeah.